Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
It's the summer of 207 BC, and the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca has been the scourge of Rome for well over a decade, roaming throughout the Italian peninsula, winning uh, victories that are still studied today by military historians, and keeping Rome in a defensive posture, protecting its capital and also protecting the territory that it controls. And while Hannibal lacks the men and materials to actually lay siege to Rome itself, he is creating a situation where it does appear possible that Carthage, which has long been Rome's enemy, could be victorious and Rome could fall. In fact, it's during this time in the summer of 207 BC that Hannibal is hoping to link up with the forces of his younger brother, Hasdrubal, who has brought his forces up through Spain, also winning victories over Roman generals and Roman armies, has crossed the Alps very similar to the way that Hannibal had, in that audacious way, in Hannibal's case, crossing the Alps with elephants a decade before. And Hannibal and Hasdrubal are looking to link their forces, with now the combined armies perhaps being large enough and with enough material and siege equipment and the other types of resources that would actually make laying siege to the capital city, Rome itself, possible. And so this is a turning point in what's known as the Second Punic War, the wars between Rome and Carthage. They've been enemies for decades, arch rivals in the central and in the western Mediterranean. But in that particular period of time, that fateful June summer of 207 BC, a messenger is intercepted. It's a messenger that is sent by Hasdrubal that is sending a message to Hannibal about where they will join forces and bring that combined force together under Hannibal's control and be able to march and more effectively take the war to Rome instead of the way that Hannibal has been dancing around throughout the continent for the last decade. However, that messenger is captured, and as a result, the location and the planned joining of the forces becomes known to the Roman forces, and as a result of that, eventually a battle is fought, the Battle of Materus. And at the Battle of Materus, the Romans are able to be victorious because of their knowledge of what was going to take place, the knowledge of the Carthaginian plans. And as a result of that, eventually Hannibal and his brother are put on the defensive. His brother is killed, actually, and his head is actually tossed over the wall into Hannibal's camp. And soon thereafter, after another few years, Hannibal is actually called back to the northern part of the African continent to actually defend Carthage itself, because it's well known, well understood at that point, that Rome now will not just be fighting a defensive battle on the Italian peninsula, but will be taking the offense to Carthage. And eventually Carthage will fall, and as a result of that, Rome will go on to become what we know her to be in the real timeline of history, to become the republic that she is, and then will continue out to become empire, and eventually Rome will rule most of the known world, not falling until 476 AD, at least formally by the way that most historians reckon that fall. Welcome today to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. I'm Don, your host, and we're going to look down an alternate path of history today that has a different outcome to this war of antiquity between Rome and Carthage, and the scenario where instead of ultimately Carthage falling to Rome in the decades that would follow these events of 207 BC, let's imagine that messenger was not intercepted. That messenger makes it to Hannibal, that Hannibal and his younger brother Hasdrubal are able to join their forces, and the brilliant General Hannibal leads those combined forces, eventually laying siege to and capturing Rome and bringing an end to the glory that was the Roman Republic, premature of it becoming the Roman Empire. How might history have been different if, in fact, Carthage had won that Second Punic War, and as a result, we would not have seen Rome as we know her and being such a dominant force in history, world history, but also particularly in the history of the West? Like some other topics that we've covered here on the podcast, this is one of those what-ifs of history that actually has a very sweeping type of scope. We actually could spend probably not just a single episode, but a whole series of episodes, and perhaps we certainly will revisit the topic and perhaps in a little bit more detail. But certainly we could spend a number of episodes about the short-term difference that we would have seen in history. And once you make that short-term difference where there's not the Rome that we know so well, that is such a defining and influential force on history, and you carry things much forward in time, you can imagine a very different world that we might have today. And that difference can range not only in terms of how our politics would work, but how economy might work, the spread of Christianity, the rise of Islam. There's a number of different things that would have been impacted in major ways in a scenario where we don't eventually have the rise of Rome to dominate the entire Mediterranean area, certainly the whole basin there around the Mediterranean Sea, but also not being the dominant force in history, and then ultimately how that transitioned to being the power under which Christianity became formalized. Just a very different course of history if we have a victorious Carthage. And so much hung in the balance there in 207 BC. And so our fork today is going to center around, again, the scenario where that messenger is not captured, the plans do not fall into Roman hands, and the end result of that is Carthaginian victory. So the first thing to look at is looking at the contrast between the states and what they were in terms of sort of what was the nature of Rome versus the nature of Carthage. And I think it's true of many of us who ascribe to being a part of Western culture that we know a lot about Rome, but I think for the average person on the street, even the average student of history, doesn't know as much about Carthage as they do about Rome. Part of that is because Rome is the long-standing empire, and we all know the great adage that history is written by the victors, and so often throughout history, particularly the history from the middle part of the first millennium BC through to the first half of the first millennium AD, is really the period of Rome. So much of that is dominated by the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which gave stability and allowed the influence of a number of different factors, both military, economic, and social, to rise as the Romans conquer Greece, absorb Greek culture into their Roman ethos, and forge what eventually becomes one of the greatest and most enduring empires in terms of time that we know of in the history of mankind. And so again, on today's episode, I'm going to focus primarily again just on some of the broad sweeps of what would be different with a Carthage victory in the Punic Wars, and I'm going to place that victory again in the latter part of the 200s BC. So again, looking at those events around 207 BC as being the fork in time, and begin with sort of the contrast between the two powerful city-states represented by Rome and by Carthage. Rome was very much a military power, a land-based military power from its founding. Rome sort of not having a true port, quite in the sense of the types of ports that existed throughout much of the Mediterranean and being somewhat inland. Carthage being a coastal city and being originally founded by Phoenicians who had come across the Mediterranean to that part of the North African coast, just slightly west of the boot of Italy, if you're trying to visualize exactly where Carthage existed on the map. Rome and Carthage really being not that far apart in terms of what divided them. They were divided by the Mediterranean, but they're in that central Mediterranean area, with Carthage even sort of facing towards a eastern type of fixture as it looks towards the Mediterranean. But the Carthaginians were traders. They were sailors. That Phoenician descent for them made them a very different type of people. And so one of the interesting contrasts that exists between Rome and Carthage, which then plays out into how things would have been different with a victory by Carthage, is the fact that Carthage, while certainly militarily capable, almost every modern military general, every modern military in its leadership, they extensively study Hannibal as one of the great generals of all time, the Carthaginian general who's referenced in this particular campaign, and who I'm going to give credit to with the assistance of linking up with his younger brother's troops, would have been the one that overcame Rome. while they certainly didn't lack for being a military power, the brilliance of the Barca family, the leaders that were inside of that, as terms of being generals, their power, their wealth as an empire, primarily was based upon trade. And so, one of the first contrasts that would exist in a situation where Carthage was victorious, they would have subjected the city of Rome and the territory that Rome controlled. And by the way, Rome here in approximately 200 BC is nowhere near having the area of control that you may think of as we draw later in time. Greece is still independent of Rome. In fact, it's during the Second Punic War, the period of time that this divergence takes place, that the Romans are also dealing with Greek uprisings against them, taking advantage of the fact that they're distracted by their war and by Hannibal being on the Italian peninsula and against like reigning terror in terms of the military threat that existed there. And so one of the primary differences, again, would have been Carthage being much more economic in the way that it would have interacted and far less militaristic. It's possible that a victorious Hannibal may have been sent elsewhere to conquer in the name of Carthage, but it's much more likely that Carthage would have extended its influence through trade and through diplomacy and interlocking things from an economic standpoint. And so if you want to imagine that there's a rise of a Carthaginian empire in lieu of a Roman empire, I think you think of the Roman Empire primarily being brought into force by military action and by military supremacy, whereas Carthage would have risen through economic relationships. And so the nature or tenor of that empire would have been very different. It's also very likely that as a result of that, there would not have been, we talk so often about the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Rome was far more concerned while being warring about keeping things at peace, keeping the money flowing, keeping the tribute flowing, keeping the taxes flowing. Carthage would not have probably been able to impose any type of Carthaginian peace. No Pax Carthage would have taken place. And so the development of a number of the other people groups, which eventually became subjected to Rome, probably would not have worked in quite exactly the same way under Carthage. Just if you look at the way that the Carthaginians interacted with those on the Iberian Peninsula, what eventually would become the territories that we think of Spain and Portugal as, the influence they might have had on the Gauls. The Gauls might have been, for example, more independent than they were when they were eventually brought to hand and brought under Roman domination. And so the face of Western Europe, how Carthage would have influenced the areas that we think of as being Spain, more of an established, longer enduring Germanic presence in the portions of Western Europe. The areas that we think of today as being Gaul and we think of as being France, being far more Germanic. And the Carthaginians probably would not have been as likely to have carried their exploits further east in such a way that they would have conquered the Greeks. They certainly may have allied with the Greeks to push back threats that were coming from the Seleucids and ultimately the Persians, the Seleucids being falling out of the the breakup of Alexander's empire and the Seleucid empire rising up against the Egyptian Ptolemaic empire. And so it's much easier to imagine a situation where Carthage would have been influential through trade, and certainly would have risen to the stage of being the leading and most dominant player in the politics and in how things worked in the area of the Mediterranean, but not in the same way that Rome would have. And so you would have seen a more distinct culture, a less unified culture than the culture that you saw under Rome. Even as Greek influence was brought into Roman culture was dominant, just like the Roman military was dominant. I think most historians would agree that Carthage would not have been as dominant in terms of imposing its culture on the other parts of the Mediterranean that eventually fell under Roman control. And so you would have had a different play out in the short-term element of history in terms of how persistent, again, the Germanic tribes would have been, the Gauls, later the Goths, the Visigoths, those that eventually came into blows with Rome, but would have had the chance to develop on their own far more independently. And again, it's very likely to believe that there would have been the ability for the Persians to have pushed their influence much further east into the Levant, perhaps even down threatening, as they had a number of times against Egypt, without Egypt being a client state of Rome and without the territories of Palestine and the Levant being under the control of Rome. And so it's possible to imagine that just 2 centuries later, at the time of Christ, Christ having been born in a Persian-controlled Palestine, dominating perhaps or coexisting with the Jewish elements that were there in a different way than the Jewish elements persisted under Rome. And that even if you have the situation where eventually there's the crucifixion and the same events that you find in real history that led to the rise of Christianity, it's easy to imagine, for example, imagining someone like a Paul who goes to become a missionary into the Greek territories of what is then the Roman Empire, heading west from Jerusalem and west from Judea and into Asia Minor and then ultimately into Rome, might have going in the other direction towards the Persian influences that would have existed either in the areas of Babylon or even in the areas that we think of today as modern day Iran. And so one of the early, just in the first couple of centuries, would have been a different economic climate, a different domination mode, where Carthage may have been more dominant through trade and less through military, more through alliance than through actual dictatorship. And you can even then imagine the rise of Christianity coming in a very different way, not being under persecution or in conflict with Roman authority, but rising actually under the area of either Persian or some other farther eastern influence that would have been predominant in the area of Levant. Again, one of the other things that's interesting to speculate on in sort of the broad sort of sweep of history is remembering that the Phoenicians were sailors. They were much more adept at nautical skills than what we find with Rome. And so already being on the northern African continent, it's possible to imagine that some of the things that we saw later, much later, literally millennia later, when Portuguese navigators began to work down the western coast of Africa, rounding the western coast of Africa, down around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually establishing sea routes that led towards Indian trade. Imagine that that's actually being developed out of Carthage as the center for that. And so you might have had a situation where eventually, because of Rome being situated and the Italian peninsula being on the southern portion of the European continent, you might have had a situation under Carthage where there was much more of an African domination of the known world. And so the extent to which the territories of northern Africa, directly under Carthaginian control, would have certainly been more influential. That leading up to, as it crossed over into Europe in the areas of modern-day Spain and Portugal. But imagine the situation where you have Carthaginian navigators who are sailing, again, along the western coast of Africa, and trade routes are open deeper into Africa. And Africa, below the Sahara, as well as all the way down to the areas that we think of as being the southern tip of Africa, would have been much more influential in terms of how they interacted with a world under Carthage than they were with a world under Rome. Now imagine that some of those Carthaginian sailors who are sailing south and are hugging along the coast of Africa, let's say they get blown or they take it upon themselves to actually try to sail further west. And so one of the other things to consider is that the discovery of the New World, that the discovery of the Americas could have happened much earlier and could have happened in a much different way under Carthage than it did under Rome, and then eventually the Dark Ages that existed for the better part of millennia after the fall of Rome. So imagine a scenario where there's not the fall of Rome, there's not the tremendous impact that we think of as being the period of time of the Dark Ages needing the Renaissance. Imagine that there's a continuation of the trade and the activity of Carthage, and as a result of that, their prowess, their seamanship prowess, that they are able to cross over and make contact with the peoples of the New World, say maybe as much as 1,000 years earlier than what actually happened. Under that scenario, this would be before the Aztecs. This would be in some ways even before the rise of the Incas. You would have the situation where Carthage meets the Mayans. This is one of those things that we're now out into such an area of speculation here. It's hard to imagine how that would have gone down. But what would have happened if instead of Spanish conquistadors that are coming under the Christian flag, looking to both explore as well as conquer and convert the New World, are instead Carthaginians that are coming to do trade with the New World. is that the possibility that the Mayan civilization would have picked up and understood and discovered things from the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians would have discovered things from the Mayans. The Mayans might have persisted and grown stronger as a result of that relationship. And now we're out into that territory of the historical what if in terms of the counterfactual, where there's so many possible divergence paths that you can go down, it's hard to imagine. But it's not hard to imagine one scenario being where there is still a Mayan influence down to today that exists in the Western Hemisphere as a result of not falling eventually to the situations that arose with the coming of the Spanish and the coming of the others that came to settle the New World under a scenario where Rome was victorious, and eventually we have the carrying forth of a Roman Western culture. Imagine instead a Carthaginian Western culture and how that might have interplayed with its discovery of the New World. To me, one of the more intriguing thoughts or concepts to explore just thinking about that would be how much of Mayan understanding was lost as a result of the lack of preservation of their culture, understanding about their writing systems, understanding about their history, so much that archaeology has had to seek with tremendous effort to try to reclaim and rediscover, even down to the present age. Imagine that the Carthaginians who used and would have exported the Phoenician alphabet come wanting to learn and record from the Mayans versus conquer the Mayans. And imagine what it would be like to have a better understanding of their understanding of mathematics, their understanding of cosmology, all the types of things that would have come from a different first contact that might have existed between Carthage and Rome. In all fairness, it is possible to assume that Carthage, had they been victorious over Rome, might have taken on more the personages or the persona of Rome. And so to wax poetically about how sort of non-menacing or how sort of benevolent Carthage might have been as the major influence and the major power in the world is perhaps a little naive, in the sense that it's possible that by the time we would have arrived down to when that discovery might have taken place, Carthage would have been contaminated by its position of leadership, and so some of the same things might have happened. But it's interesting to speculate on how things might have been different had a culture that was more focused on trade versus conquest been the dominant force, that being Carthage. And again, as I said today, on today's episode, we're just going to look at the broad sweep. So sort of the last thing I want to talk about is just the whole concept of how technology and science may have persisted under Carthage, unlike what it did under Rome. Certainly we know that Western culture, Western civilization is marked by, after Rome's fall, this long period, the Dark Ages, that lasts for about 1,000 years, that eventually are reversed by the Renaissance and spurring on of new scientific discovery and new thought, actually inspired by rediscovering old thought so often. To me, that's one of the great ironies of the Renaissance. That's why it's called the Renaissance. It's returning back and gaining things that have been lost from the Greek period. In the situation where there's a Carthage, there's sort of two broad sweeps or scopes that you can look at. One would be is that there might not have ever been that with the fall of a large empire like Rome was, sort of bringing everything to a crashing halt in a way, this rise of barbarism. To the extent that there still would have been barbaric peoples, it would have been a gradual decline of Carthage and other cultures and other powers coming into being. So you wouldn't have had necessarily this sort of massive break in history that led to the Dark Ages and led to this period of stagnation. So one of the things that's always interesting to me when you think about the growth of science is if you don't push the pause button on scientific discovery and scientific inquisition and technology and its spread and its innovation, it's interesting to think about just what a few years difference can make in the way that accelerates. To me, sitting here in the early part of the 21st century, the realization of how things have changed just in the last 25 years, then looking back 100 years prior to that and 100 years prior to that, is there comes a point when if you're able to begin the types of things that we see in terms of the expansion of technology and of scientific understanding, if you can begin those much earlier, you don't have this very small change in terms of what there, you have this exponential change. Again, imagine if what we know as being the technology of 1900 is set back to 900 AD or is set back to 90 AD. as a result of the way that things progress moving forward from 200 BC. So if you have the scenario where you don't have the lost time there, when does space travel happen? When does other types of exploration take place? When are scientific discoveries made in the important areas like medicine, and in areas like agriculture? The types of things that have a tremendous impact on the way society works. Longevity of life, economic systems, the development of politics and political systems that are also changed by the change in the economy and the change in science. And so, to me, one of the other interesting things in terms of broad strokes of history and broad sweeps, and certainly the Carthage versus Rome diversion here fits into that category, is how much different things could be. Would I be recording this podcast from a space station that's around Saturn, or would we be somehow already have achieved interstellar travel by this point as a result of moving forward? Where are we going to be in 200 years? It might be exactly where we would be today if we had not lost time back in the past. And so looking at that broad sweep of history to me is always amazing when you think about how that would have impacted the speed of progress. And progress there is not just defined by science, although that's a big part of it, but progress is also defined by the growth of institutions and of society and of thought and of philosophy in a very different way. And of course, as I've already mentioned, if you look at the influence that Christianity eventually has as a result of becoming the official religion of Rome, if you don't have that same type of rise of Christianity, again, I'm not going to argue against Christianity here, but if you have it portrayed out in history a different way, where it spreads east instead of spreading west, where it's, even if it does spread east, it comes, even if it does spread west, I'm afraid, or sorry, it comes to Carthage being the center of that instead of being Rome. The influence that it has on changing the way that Europe evolved, eventually how the barbaric tribes of Central and Northern Europe are brought underneath Christian influence in such a way that influences their politics eventually. For example, Alexis is not here to participate in this particular episode, but what's the outcome for Britain under a scenario where there's not a touch of Rome, and then eventually there's the movements that come as a result of Christian influence on the continent in the areas that we think of as modern-day France and Germany, and their influences, and even into Scandinavia and their eventual influences on the British Isles? What if those are left in a different way? The Celts hold more of a hold there over time, and so the tradition that arises in Britain is far more of its older tradition, of a Celtic tradition, not one that blends together elements of that Celtic tradition and eventually blends in Christianity to it. And so you can see that in big sweeping scopes, as I've talked about here in terms of the global scope of history, in terms of contact between the old world and the new world, but even in the smaller scopes, for example, what happens in Britain if Carthage is victorious over Rome could be very, very different. And of course, then that plays out carrying down all the way to today in terms of for example, America having derived its roots from English roots. What if there are no English roots, as we know of them today, that are influenced by the timeline that we're familiar with, but instead there's a Celtic tradition that's in Britain that's entirely different. And so even the way that things play out in the New World would be different because of what had happened in the Old. So again, I'm sure we'll revisit this topic at some point, perhaps in some more detail. In fact, if you're interested in providing some insights or thoughts, I would invite you to go to our website. That's www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Provide feedback on this episode or suggest some of the ways that you think history might have been different or might have been influenced differently with the victory of Carthage over Rome and how that would have changed so much of what we fundamentally understand. And again, we haven't even talked about how that may have changed the impact of the Western world on Eastern culture, places like India and China and the other places which are not even mentioned or haven't been mentioned up until now, and how it all plays together. So once again, this is Don signing off for our episode today from A Fork in Time. As we do so, we just want to say once again thank you, as we always do. We do encourage you to visit our website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. You'll see there ways to give us feedback, the ways to participate as part of our alternate history community. If you enjoy the podcast and are capable of doing so and are willing to do so, we'd invite you to visit our link there, our Patreon page, where you can provide not only the moral support for the podcast, but if it's something you're able and willing to do, financial support for the podcast as well. But more than anything else, we do thank you for your time and your attention and for joining us today, particularly as my mind is also heavy, continues to be heavy with the global pandemic that we're working through now. I certainly hope and pray that all of our listeners are well or healthy and are going through these difficult, turbulent times as best they can. We would still encourage you to visit our website and give us just some feedback there with the COVID check-in that we have, and we'd like to hear from you and hear how you're doing. So again, once again, I appreciate your time and your attention. And as I sign off today for this episode of A Fork in Time, I'll invite you back next time. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.